Good morning and welcome to Hanover's Diversity webinar. It seems timely that we are having this event during National Inclusion Week. Off the back of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, we have a swirl of much needed debate about inclusion and diversity right now, in society as well as in the workplace. Intuitively, we all know what is the right thing to do, but of course it's never that simple. Some of this comes down to understanding. This is nowhere more true than with neurodiversity. It is largely invisible, overlapping in traits, and is sometimes uncomfortable to deal with. Navigating neurodiversity is confusing. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Ian Iceton, who is going to talk about the challenges of recruiting and employing neurodivergent individuals, as well as the importance for organisations to go beyond diversity and truly embrace inclusion and belonging, with a particular focus on neurodiversity. This morning, you'll be given advice on how to hire, how to manage, and how to adapt your recruitment processes to get the best out of neurodivergent individuals. My name is Christina Ratings, and I am a partner at Hanover and a member of Hanover's D&I committee. To kick things off, here are a few housekeeping rules. The event will be recorded and will be hosted on YouTube and on our website. This recording will be sent to all attendees following this session. Timings. Following a brief introduction about Hanover and our guest speaker, Ian will present for about 20 to 25 minutes. My colleague Paul will then ask a few direct questions and open the event up to the floor. We will finish no later than 11 o'clock. Everyone except for the key host will be set to mute, but please check you are muted to avoid any interference. If you have a question, please write this in the chat box within the Zoom application. Paul will present your questions to Ian during the Q&A session. Ian has kindly said he is open to connecting with people after the event. He does provide consultancy service, so do let Hanover know if you feel your firm would benefit from additional consultation, and we will connect you to Ian. So, just very briefly, and for those of you who don't know Hanover, let me give you a brief summary. We are a global provider of talent solutions, primarily focused on financial services and technology. We have a 25-year track record and 3 distinct lines of business: Hanover Executive Search, Hanover Leadership Solutions, and Hanover Market Insights. Put simply, Hanover's key purpose is providing talent solutions that will make a fundamental difference to our clients. So, without further delay, I am delighted to introduce you to Ian Iceton. Ian is a freelance consultant in HR, people, inclusion and diversity, and pension issues. He has very recently left corporate life after 20 years as an HR director for organisations including River and Mercantile, Volkswagen, Skanska, and National Network Rail. Ian has also spent the last 4 years undertaking a doctorate at Cranfield University, focusing his research into autism in the workplace. This research has led him to interview many autistic candidates and employees and their line managers, and has given him considerable insight into the challenges these people face and the issues raised for organisations employing them. So, on that note, over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to all of your colleagues at Hanover as well for this opportunity. And good morning and welcome to all of you that are on this Zoom this morning. I hope that we have a good conversation together. As Christine says, my background for the last 20 years or so has been in HR, and I've done a lot of work in D&I. And one of the things that struck me progressively over the last few years is that whilst we've made great progress, particularly around diversity, if we've got great women in our businesses and organisations and we've recruited excellent people with ethnic backgrounds, are we really getting all of their talent to the fore in our organisations? And I came across this great graphic if I can get the pages to move. My apologies, this was working a moment ago. Oh, there we go. So I came across this great graphic recently, which talked about diversity being invited to the party, inclusion being asked to dance, and belonging is when you can dance like there's no one watching. And I think all of us, when you look at that, fully understand the difference between those three states. And I wonder whether as organisations, we've invited lots of diverse people to our parties, but as organisations, have we really made them feel included and belonging such that we're getting the best out of them? So perhaps we should be trying harder to thinking about what we need to do to be inclusive and to achieve belonging. And I'm going to use neurodiversity today as the basis for thinking about that, but I think it applies to all aspects of diversity. And as Christina said, I've been studying in particular autism and autism recruitment, but as I say, I think it applies across all aspects of neurodiversity. So what we're going to cover, we'll talk a little bit about definitions, and then specifically how I think both an employer can look at recruitment and employment. Talk about research. As Christina said, I've spent the last 4 years working at Cranfield University in the School of Management, and I've interviewed a lot of people. So that brings a great wealth of insight. I've also been very fortunate to go across to the United States on 2 occasions. They have an annual Autism in Work conference hosted by Microsoft. And there's 100 organisations that are doing great work in this area, and I've managed to learn quite a bit from them too. So this talk is really based on those examples that I found. And also I've been obviously doing a lot of reading, a lot of studying. There's a great piece of research going on called DARE at University College London, which is also very relevant. And hopefully you'll find out, as Christina said, how you as an organisation can make a difference in your recruitment, how you can help employment go better for these groups of people, and particularly how you can support line managers. And then we'll finish off looking at some tools that are available and what else that you might need to think about. So what is neurodiversity? Well, I'm going to go through 3 very quick definitions because actually there's no one readily agreed definition that everybody believes is the same thing. So first one just says, here's 5 things that you've probably heard of: autism and Asperger's, all part of the autism spectrum disorders, or ASD. There's a lot of initials involved in these cases. ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. And those are probably the most common understandings of neurodiversity. You may also, if you've been looking at this subject at all, seen this model, which is one that's been in circulation for a couple of years now. And it adds Tourette's to the 5 categories that we looked before. And it also starts to add some of the so-called common traits of people that have some of these conditions. Now, I have to say straight away that the more I've studied neurodiversity, the more dangerous I've realized that stereotypes are. Everybody's different. Every individual is different. And that's true of people in all of these groups. But having said that, there are some things that do seem to be common, such as challenges around organization, concentrations, and time management, listening skills. And I think the one that people are most common and most aware of is just general communication challenges. And when we go on to talk in a minute about recruitment processes and employment processes, that's where those challenges with communication becomes such an important area for everybody involved to think about. More recently, I came across this middle model. Now, you won't be able to read it all in the time we've got now, but Hanover are going to share the slides afterwards so you can study it in more depth later. But what this looks at is perhaps rather than some of the challenges faced by neurodiverse colleagues, it actually says there may be some specific and unique challenges, opportunities, skills that people have. And again, I'd be wary of stereotypes, but it is interesting, and as I say, I've studied particularly ASD, that these aspects, for example, such as concentration and sequencing and fine detail, can be things that occur more often in that group. So, let's think about what you as an organisation can do. And I'm conscious perhaps somebody's just not on mute, so if you're typing away so as to not distract other people, perhaps put yourself back on mute. What does research tell us? Well, first of all, again, a lot of this is new and emerging information, but it's believed that perhaps between 10 and 15% of our workforce has one or more of the neurodiverse conditions, and often individuals will have more than one element at the same time. Research has also shown us that a much lower proportion of these people are in employment. For example, the National Autistic Society believes that in the UK, only about 16% of autistic adults are in full-time employment compared to about 66% across the rest of the population. So there's a huge employment gap there, which is both a drain on the economy, it's clearly frustrating for those as individuals, and it's a huge opportunity for organisations when we're looking for talent to say, how do we get those people into our business? Another thing that, as caring and considerate employers we should be thinking about is research also shows that for neurodiverse people, their levels of stress and mental health issues are much higher on average than is typical, often because they're having to deal with these unseen or hidden challenges that we talked about at the start. So, being conscious of this and thinking about this is really important if we want to get the best out of these people. So, what as organisations can you do to make a difference in terms of recruitment? Well, I think carefully about job descriptions and role profiles and how they're written, so you don't exclude people unnecessarily. One of the things that I found, again, without wanting to stereotype, is that quite often autistic people, for example, will take communication very literally. So if you have a job description which you advertise that has 8, 9, 10 requirements, neurotypicals might think, well, I can do some of those, so I'll apply. An autistic person might look at that, and if they can't do every single facet that you list, they'll probably just self-exclude. And similarly, if you use definitions, terminology, or anything that's company or industry specific, they may not look for it. They may just say, I don't get that role, it's not for me, and they'll rule themselves out. We should be writing our job specs and our job profiles so that we don't exclude people at that stage before they've even had a chance to think about it. And then when you're thinking about other language, terminology, even the fonts, color sizes, style of ads, for dyslexic people, there's software available that you can put through your ads, and particularly stuff that you put on your website, to make it more accessible. And also think about your selection criteria and processes so that they're inclusive rather than exclusive and aren't based on certain assumptions. I had a great example recently of one of what I would call lazy HR questions, and I've probably been guilty of using things like this in the past, but I had an autistic candidate tell me that they'd been declined for a role that they'd applied for, and when they asked for feedback, they were given some of the answers for some of the questions in their interview that they hadn't been considered to do very well for. And the question that struck in this autistic chap's mind was, he was asked, what will you be doing in 5 years' time? And his answer was, that's a stupid question. I have no idea what I'll be doing in 5 years' time. How can anybody know? Because the world is in such turmoil, everything can change. And he was given the feedback that he was not very ambitious, he wasn't looking ahead, and he hadn't understood the question. Well, actually, I could argue he'd answered the question more accurately than anybody else, but that was an assumption and a prejudice in terms of how people are expecting. We use these questions to actually as a proxy for something else. What the person actually meant was a combination of, tell me about your career ambitions, how do you see your personal development going? But they didn't ask that question. They asked something that, taken literally, could be interpreted in a very different way. The other things to do include thinking about how you can make it really clear to candidates that you support neurodiverse applications. And also train managers, particularly as people who are recruiters, to think about what they might need to look for and how they can make that process more welcoming and more likely to be inclusive. And also think about the recruitment logistics. Can you provide information in advance to reduce stress levels? Everybody gets stressed about going for a job interview, worrying about whether they're going to be on time, whether they're going to find the right place. But for some neurodiverse people, particularly some of the autistic people, I found that can be almost so inhibiting that they might not go for an interview just because they don't feel comfortable about the logistics. So the more you can do to make that comfortable for them, the less likely you're going to exclude great people before they've even got to the point of you having a chance to talk to them and seeing how brilliant that they are. So what else can you do in terms of recruitment? Well, Think about the requirements that you have for certain jobs. How, again, a little bit lazy, and I can say this as one of the HR people that's fallen into this trap in the past. How many jobs, nearly all, I think the job description I've seen, say interpersonal skills, essential, must be a team player. But in reality, some jobs really don't need this. When I was working for Network Rail, we had a great example. We had a job that was a train timetable planner. And even if you've not worked in the rail industry, you can probably conjure up an image of what that job involves. It's masses of data about thousands of trains that are moving up and down the lines all the time. And the person, if you actually go and see them doing the job, they're sat with at least 3, sometimes 4 screens in front of them, and they need to concentrate really hard because we don't want them to schedule 2 trains heading towards each other on the same piece of track. Now, do we really want that person to be a chatty individual that's always talking to the colleagues? Or do we want someone that's really focused and is actually quite good at blocking out those distractions? It's actually the latter. And Network Rail were brilliant. They had changed their job description and actually focused on the things that really matter for that. So think about your jobs and think about what criteria you're talking about and whether they're really the ones that are essential. As I said before, there's also a huge raft of software that's available now to help you with wording of all sorts of things like ads. You can make the text less gender specific. You can put a whole bunch of people off in different ways just by the words that you use without realizing it. And have you built expectations around certain personality types? And are they built into selection processes? I've been party to quite a number of assessment centres in my time when you observe a group of people working together, and you're inevitably almost drawn to those characters that kind of have a share of voice, are perhaps leading the group without having the badge of leadership. And how often do we give attention to the one that might be a bit quieter, but just inserts that key observation or that other thought that might turn the whole direction of the meeting? And you have to be trained to be thinking about that and be careful about it. And also, how much do we recruit for past experiences that actually might not be available to everybody? Many people that are neurodiverse and have had challenges through the education system because, to be fair, particularly historically, might be getting a little bit better now, but historically, the education system has not found dealing with neurodiverse people easy. So they might not have got all the qualifications. They might not have done some of the summer jobs or some other things. So their CV, if all you look at is that, might have some gaps, but actually, surely what you want is to look at their future potential and the skills that they might have, and can you train some of the other things that they don't bring? So, open your mind and be creative to your recruitment processes. There's some great stuff being done by a number of organizations already being different and thinking about this. So Microsoft, as I mentioned in the US, is fabulous. They do technical tests before they look at a person's CV. Here in the UK, the civil service is set out an ambition to be the most diverse recruiter and employer, and it's doing all sorts of things. It's using things like British Sign Language on its website. It's adapted some of its tests so that blind people can take them, or people with different neurodivergent conditions have a chance to adapt the process. They don't have one size fits all. The other thing that I've recently become aware of is that a lot of organizations, and I've done it as well, we use psychometric tests. And until I'd come across something called the Cambridge Code, which is a psychoanalytical assessment, I hadn't realized that most of the psychometric tests that we use assume and presume some knowledge of office life and how people typically interact. Now, for people that might have a different level of experience or might interpret through their communication challenges the office in a different way, most of those tests actually have an inherent bias in them. Whereas a psychoanalytical test like the Cambridge Code, which doesn't look at in-office perceptions, but actually tells you about the character of a person and their inherent capabilities just based on their kind of DNA of their brain, are much less likely to exclude people. So I would really urge you to think about which assessment tests you're using. Some other things that you might have heard about, and you might be challenging for some of your people, some of your managers, but Would there really be a problem with providing interview questions in advance? Are you interested in somebody's ability to just respond really quickly to something that they've not heard? Maybe for a couple of jobs that is important, but for a lot of jobs it's not. Surely you want to know, once they've had a chance to think about what you're interested in, to give you their best answer, their most thoughtful answer. Also, have you really asked carefully about special arrangements? One of the traps I think we fall into is we're all aware of the Disability Act. We all put a box on our application forms that says, if you have a disability, tick this box and we'll be good to you. But actually, many people don't want to tick that box. Many people who are neurodivergents, divergent, but especially some of the autistic people I speak to, don't see themselves as being disabled. They just think of themselves as different. In fact, actually, if we've got more time to talk later, they think actually it's probably the neurotypicals, the ones that have got the most of the problems, and that they are the ones that actually see things more clearly. So can you put something on your applications that doesn't just say, are you disabled? Can you make it more general and just say, is there anything about our application process or our recruitment process that you might need any consideration with, and we would welcome talking to you about it? It's a much more open way of saying it. And going back to what I said about the stress of an application, one of the autistic people I was dealing with said they'd had a great experience at an organization that didn't just provide a map to the building where they were going to be recruited, but they provided a photograph of that building, and then another photograph of the actual reception, and then a photograph of the actual receptionists smiling, waiting for them to come into the office. And that had such an impact on the candidates and made them much less stressed about it. And if you think about it, why couldn't we do that for all applicants, all interviews? It doesn't matter whether you're thinking neurodivergent or not. Nobody loses out from that. And once you've printed the photos out, you can stick them on every invite. And it just shows you've thought about people. And I certainly, in the last few months of my corporate career, was doing that wherever possible. And also thinking about logistics and recruitment, think about interview rooms themselves very carefully. I'll come on to it in a moment, but many neurodiverse people, particularly people on the autism spectrum, have sensory issues. So think about things like the lighting. Don't just stroll in with 2 minutes to go, or even worse, go and collect the candidate from reception and go and find the room together and get there and find that you're really on top of each other, or there's a spotlight staring in their face. Do a bit of thinking about it. Make sure that you're welcoming. And here's a really interesting one, and this came out from a couple of the people that I interviewed. Train your interviewers to cope with thinking pauses. Now, I know, having done joint recruitment with many line managers are pretty poor at interviews, full stop. And they're very bad at this deliberate pause. But actually, with autistic people, they need time to process the question and give you their response. And I found a couple of times by just waiting, I got brilliant answers from people that it would have been so easy for me to talk over and continue the process and not give them that processing time. So do think carefully about the way that you train people to think about how they deal with interviews. And then moving on a little bit, once you have recruited people, what can you do to ensure that as I say, all diverse people, but particularly neurodiverse people, actually find the experience of being employed a one that they're comfortable with and pleasant with? And going back to what we said, do they feel not just invited to the dance, but are they ready to actually get on the dance floor? And also, don't forget, quite a lot of people don't disclose when they first get recruited that they are neurodivergent. So you might have more people in your business that you need to take consideration from than you've actually realized. So again, coming back to one of my recurring themes, train your line managers to be aware and to think about how they will manage the needs of employees appropriately. Do they have a good set of standard questions that every time they get a new recruit and every time somebody transfers into their department, they can ask them about? Do you provide a supportive culture generally? Is there cross-company communications about how you deal with these issues? Have you made it easy for reasonable adjustments to be made available? Now, lots of organizations say they do, but when I've delved in and interviewed people, often the process of getting reasonable adjustments can be painful for the individual. It can be painful for the line manager who gets frustrated because there's perhaps budget constraints or process constraints. Things like the software that's now available for dyslexic people, that should just be readily available. It should be, there shouldn't be a decision involved in the process. Nobody should have to sign it off. If somebody asks for it, they're only going to ask for it if they need it. So give it to them and make it as simple as possible. Also, a number of the organisations I've worked in have had fantastic staff networks, affinity groups, where people can get together with people that maybe share some of the challenges that they face, and gives them another outlet other than their direct team colleagues and their manager to discuss some of the challenges, and perhaps sometimes come to the business and explain, actually, if you could do these three things for us, we would all be better off. One other thing to think about, and I've done a couple of bits of work recently with my consultancy hat on, where organisations have asked me to look at their performance management criteria and processes. And actually what's interesting is quite often we also have these designed in a way that, without realising it, but you should have done, we create biases against certain groups. So quite often there's a criteria in there about communication style. And again, back to this interpersonal skills and how you influence across the business. And certainly for autistic people with a different communication style, our managers trained to think about how they will assess that and how they will score that in a way that doesn't automatically keep those autistic people or neurodivergent people you do recruit in the lowest level of business, because they can never possibly progress. That's definitely an area that I think many organisations can look at. And then coming back to where we started, think about those mental health first aid options that you have and any additional support that you might provide to all the organisation, because clearly, particularly in the kind of pandemic times that we've had this last 6 to 8 months, but I think just generally, as I said, a lot of neurodivergent people, and I would imagine, a lot of people with any kind of diversity find that, because they're having to work harder, because they're having to break down barriers, because they don't fit the norm, they've just got to put that extra bit of effort in. So why don't we as organisations meet them and help them by putting that extra bit of effort in to make it easier for them and provide the support that they might require? So hopefully you can see that's quite a lot of things that we can do, not just in terms of recruitment, but also in terms of once they've joined us, that will make their lives better and therefore allow them to perform better, and therefore for you to get that real talent and skill that neurodiverse people bring. And actually, if you stop and think for a moment, one of the reasons, in fact, if you go back to the McKinsey reports, probably the main reason from a kind of business point of view, forget the moral and ethic justification for a moment, but from a business point of view, the reason why we like diversity is because it reduces risk. It brings different ideas and different perspectives, allows you to be creative. Well, it's no good getting this diversity into the business and then not providing the environment where those different views can flourish and be listened to. Or if they're so busy being distracted by other things, then again, you're not getting the power of that talent. And one area in particular I really want to focus on is sensory challenges. And this was an area that probably was my biggest learning through doing my doctorate research, and some really, really powerful and passionate testimonials from autistic people, because so many of them have sensory challenges that I just wasn't aware of. I think I'd been conscious that for some people lighting can be difficulty, or even noise, but the variation in challenges that people have, the need to sit in a certain direction where they're facing to or away from windows, certain sounds, certain smells, proximity to other people, textures can all be challenges. I remember really vividly one interviewee saying that listening to a person eating an apple and crunching into an apple at the adjoining desk had the same effect on him, same pain levels in his brain as being hit on the head by a hammer. Now that blew me away, frankly, in terms of not thinking about some of the challenges that people might face. So what are we doing to ask people about those challenges, and what are we doing to adapt to them? Now, what's also obvious is sometimes some of the things that would be ideal for them aren't easy, or might not even be possible at all because of the design of buildings and how we operate. But at least think about it and see what's possible. Do your managers know how to ask? For example, if you've got an open plan agile office, is it possible for some people to have fixed desks? Many employers I know who've got autistic people make that available to them. They also ensure that there's a budget and processes to make sure that requests that are made are handled easily and smoothly and don't just add to the trauma of making a person feel excluded and different. But when you do that, you also have to communicate with employees to explain that some people will be enabled to work differently. And actually, it's part of your inclusive employment approach, and not to have conversations, which I heard in one organisation, where people were starting to moan and complain that such and such a person over there was allowed a fixed desk and they weren't, because it hadn't been explained that it was actually essential as part of their sensory difficulties with their neurodivergent condition. You've got to handle that communication really carefully. So what about managers? And again, probably after the sensory issue, the next big thing that came out to me was the plea from managers to say, please train us better. We want to manage the needs of employees appropriately, but we don't feel we're trained. A lot of them were just Googling the conditions that they felt people had and making it up as they go along. So again, what can you do to support them? How can you give them processes that work easily? And how can you give them the resources to be able to do the job that most of them want to do, which is provide really good support to their employees? And if you're starting to think more generally about things, there are loads of resources that are now available. Certainly, neurodiverse organisations such as the National Autistic Society, the Dyspraxia Foundation, the Dyslexia Organisation, ADHD, their websites have got loads of things. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in any of those or you think that your organisation hasn't done enough, then have a look. But also on the left-hand side here, there are two groups of organisations I would really encourage you to think about. So people like Autism Forward, Ambitious About Autism, Autistica are all organisations that are there to support both autistic employees, neurodivergent people generally, think about how they can get into work and actually help organisations employ those people. So definitely worth a look. And then there's people like the Clear Company, Slack Recruitment, the Ability people, who work across disabilities and differences generally to specifically support recruitment. And you can go to those people and you can get additional support as an organisation. So there is lots out there if you're interested. The other thing to think about, and this is true across all disabilities and all elements of diversity, it's great to have allies. And this was a spectrum of progression that allies can go through, people who can support people with differences in the organisation. I stole it from a colleague at the organisation CPMS. And have a read of this later, and you'll see that it's a great little rainbow stepping stone in terms of you can push yourself and push others to get more engaged in these differences and actually make it easier for other people in your business. So just sort of getting ready to wrap up, what else can you do? Clearly, senior leaders in the organisation, it would be great if they understand the issues, act as champions and communicate across the business. And have you thought about making sure that you've got examples of neurodiverse employees in your company handbook, on your website and in your recruitment materials, so that you really do show that you're encouraging people? And have you created the opportunity for that voice to be heard, perhaps in company blogs or in the intranet? And as I said, have you thought about third-party organisations that can help? Finally, be aware of four things as a sort of, a warning, really. Be aware about people that have not disclosed. There are going to be a lot of them, particularly middle to older people, because diagnosis was less strong years ago. Be aware of intersectionality. My research and other research has shown that women in particular who are neurodiverse are often less frequently diagnosed or noticed by organisations, so they may having to cope with more issues because it's less obvious that they've got neurodiversity. Make sure that line managers who are having difficulty managing people have got the support they need. And as I said, think about those sensory issues. Just do not underestimate how powerful they can be. I'd encourage you later to look at this little model that I've been developing as part of my research at Cranfield University. We haven't got time to look at it now, but it gives you some way of thinking about the whole process of how your organisation deals with recruiting neurodiverse people. And there's a load of articles. Some of these I've published and some are in other journals. Again, you'll get the slides and you can look them up if you're interested. I'd like to say thank you at the end to Cranfield University for supporting me through this research, but also to the Clear Company, who I mentioned a bit earlier, who do great work across a lot of different areas of diversity, and I've been producing some of my consultancy work in conjunction with them. So to finish, where I started, we've done a lot of work in terms of diversity. We've invited people to the party. We've recruited all these people with fantastic skills and experience. But are we really getting the power of that diversity in our business? I think in many cases not. We need to include them more. We want them to feel so belonging that they're out on that dance floor, giving it their all, and not worried that they might look different or sound different because they feel part of our organisations. So, Christine, back to you for questions. Or is it Paul?
Yes. Hi, Ian. Well, what a thought-provoking and insightful session. You haven't seen the conversations going on in the chat room, but we're sort of having debates all over the place, Ian. So congratulations on a very, very good presentation.
Thank you.
We've got loads of questions. I'm going to try and get through as many as we possibly can. I'm trying to sort of hit at least top 10. First one, can I kick off, Ian, with, could you give the audience your opinion on the impact lockdown may have had on neurodivergent individuals?
Yes, I certainly can. And that's a really interesting question, because I've been talking to a lot of my neurodivergent colleagues and been getting very, very different wide range of responses. The good side of it is, for some people, they've not had to do the commuting, which they don't like. You know, the sensory overloads is a real challenge, so that's a positive. And potentially, if they're going to be recruited like this over the Zoom, that might mean that it's an easier process for them in some cases, although perhaps for some not. But also, on the negative side, the change of routine for some people has been really disconcerting. And it's been even harder for them often to pick up some of the nuances across a Zoom. So it's a mixed blessing. I know one lady who's autistic that's gone out and bought the total replica of all the kit and every single item that's on her desk at work to have it at home, so that she can actually feel more comfortable. And I don't know whether my colleague, friend Charlie is on the line, and whether it's possible to unmute her. But Charlie's neurodivergent and has been going through an interesting period. And I wonder whether, Charlie, whether you wanted to comment in terms of some of the experiences. I know you've been having some interviews during the lockdown.
Yes. Sorry, what? Can you just repeat the question? I was just working to unmute myself.
Sorry, we were talking about the challenges of lockdown, and I know you've been for an interview recently during lockdown, and whether that was easier or harder for you.
For me personally, it was much harder. The lack of eye contact, ironically, and just the informality, sort of blurred lines and sort of no structure really to it. I found it a bit challenging. It was the first one I've done, so. Yeah.
So, Paul, I think that there's an example of it's actually more difficult for some people.
And Charlie, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your experiences. It really makes such an impact to the audience. So thank you. Rob Davis, Ian, asks, can you provide some examples of companies, especially in financial services, from Rob's perspective, that have made good strides to optimise neurodivergent employees on an ongoing basis? Now, I know you said Microsoft and civil service, but he was thinking more FS.
Financial services, can I think of anyone off the top of my head? Credit Suisse have been doing quite a bit. Deutsche Bank have been doing quite a bit. A number of the banks have had autistic specific recruitment processes and actually autistic specific intern programs. And again, there's a bit of a debate as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. In the long run, I think we wouldn't want to have different processes of recruiting people, but in the short term, it's a great way of being able to focus that recruitment process, make it welcoming for people, and giving people that perhaps otherwise wouldn't get chance to get into some of these roles to get the experience. And then I know a couple of people that have gone on from starting in those businesses to elsewhere across financial services. So I would say it's probably an industry that's working really hard to deal with neurodivergence.
Thanks, great answer. Tony Stenning has asked, how many companies really use tools like the Cambridge Code rather than your atypical psychometric tests?
I think at the moment, not very many. I've been, full disclosure, I've been doing some work with Cambridge Code to actually help them promote it. But I wouldn't have said it today if I didn't passionately believe that it's actually great in this situation. In all of my HR career, I've probably used 20 different psychometric tests: Hogan, Myers-Briggs, Belbin, Thomas International. They're all useful. They've all got their purpose, but they all do assume a level of knowledge and a level of awareness and communication skills, which something that's like the Cambridge Code doesn't assume. And therefore, that's why I think it's a really important step forward. And we can't make, if the more we make assumptions and the more we base our recruitment processes on assumption that everyone knows what we know and everyone's had the experiences and the history we know, the more we exclude that talent from our bank of potential recruits.
Another good answer, thanks, Ian. Kim Ruffanuck asks, what can be done to stop neurodivergent individuals being looked upon as a deficit subset of talent?
Hi, Kim. I know Kim, and it's lovely to catch up with you. And I know, Kim, that's a particularly important question for her because she works not in the UK. And one of the things that's really interesting across different parts of the world is that the level of acceptance and understanding about neurodiversity varies hugely. There are some organizations and some cultures, some countries where there is very little recognition of it, and that's very challenging. And I think probably, if we look at the countries like the UK, US and Australia that have perhaps been at the forefront, I think having role models, public role models, both in a corporate sense, but even in a social media sense, has made a difference. So if you think about in television and film in the last 5 years, there have been a lot more autistic characters portrayed. They've been in Star Trek, they've been in The Good Doctor, they've been in some of the British soaps. And whilst it's kind of almost indirect, it opens society up to recognizing that these people have a lot to give. And I think if you can convert that into corporate good examples as well, and we've had a recent example in the UK with a number of prominent people starting to disclose their own autism, I think in those other countries and those other cultures where it's less positively recognized, it will make a difference. But it takes time.
And funny enough, Charlotte, that kind of follows on from this, just wonders how many employers realistically, if the employee does declare that they're neurodivergent, would be able to have the skill set to differentiate between what that means and another disability. Yeah. I'm picking my words carefully here, Ian, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, exactly. And that's where, as I said, my pronged approach is you need to train managers and you need to have a good communication across the whole business. And just looking at the chat, Charlotte's given her, a couple of other examples of, what we think of as great questions, traditional, what I now think of as lazy HR questions that are very difficult for some people to know what we mean. We have to assume that someone's going to take a question literally. So how do we make it as easy as possible for them to tell us what we really want to know?
Yeah, and this one's more from a personal perspective because you've sort of put your hand up about lazy HR. Let me put my hand up about lazy search company and say, how do you think search firms could adopt a different approach to be much more inclusive around neurodivergent individuals in their own long list and short list presentations? Yeah,
I think that's a great question, and I think it's one that I'm keen to get organisations to think about. I suppose first and simplest is just to look harder and look in different places. So I talked about some of those kind of niche recruitment organisations that are now thinking about where they go to find neurodivergent candidates. Well, what's to stop all search agents and recruiters thinking about where they get their candidates from? But also, again, I'll try not to use the lazy word again, but perhaps just making it more positive. Be creative. Don't just rely on traditional CVs and what people have done, but think about the skills and think about other ways that you can ask about it and test for it. As I said, I think be wary of psychometrics as opposed to psychoanalytics, and I think also push clients to be more creative and encourage them to say, actually, this will bring you better results. This will reduce your risk level. This will bring you creativity. This will give you things if you're just brave enough to allow us to propose some different people. And maybe, some of the search agencies themselves could partner with some of the third-party organizations like the Kia Company, like Autistica, like the National Autistic Society, and are ambitious about autism and say, actually, run me through what you know. How do we improve what we do?
Yeah, I must admit, we've had interactions with the Clear Company, and I've just got to echo what you said. I found them to be remarkable and very different and very clear, no pun intended, about what they want to achieve versus some of the other groups that we have actually talked to before and not really found anything of real value. So,
well, I think historically, a lot of effort has been focused at looking at the challenges of people that are neurodivergent and particularly autistic who are children who are going through the education system. Now, quite rightly so, because the education system has not coped well with it, so it needed attention. But because that's where the focus has been, up until quite recently, it's been much less on that transition from an education into work, and then particularly much less once they're in work. So I'm hoping through the things that I'm involved in and talks like today and people getting interested, we can get up more organizations to think about it from an adult point of view, from an employment point of view.
Leads on to another question. Do you think we'll ever get to a place where, there's a lot of debate around whether it's diversity and inclusion or you need inclusion first to be diverse, to be diverse. Do you think we'll ever get to a place where you could actually see on a role spec that neurodivergent individuals are the preferred choice?
That's a good question. There are one or two organizations that have tried that. I think that's more because they're really just wanting to demonstrate how open they are. I'm not sure necessarily that it's a good thing to say that they're preferred. I don't know. It's interesting that I'm torn because clearly neurodivergent people have great talents, but what I think have to be really careful of, and that's where I think you go from this spectrum from diversity to inclusion. You want people to not be treated as a stereotype, and everybody's different. And certainly through my research, I've found autistic people who are highly communicative, look you in the eye, and actually doing sales jobs. Now, if you'd have asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that would be typical. So I've learned to not stereotype. Having said that, I've interviewed some people from GCHQ, and I know that there are certain roles that they've got there where they find some of their best people are neurodivergent. So I think you can argue it both ways.
Ian Pocock, then, again, this runs through what we've just discussed. He just wonders whether the shift to working from home represents a better way for certain neurodivergent people to work, i.e. not the usual sort of office environment. I know you said that a lot of people, and Charlie has said, the structure bit is very important to them. So the working from home versus, 5 days a week in the office, what's your views on that?
I think, again, probably, without sounding like I'm sitting on the fence, but genuinely, I think there are different advantages and different disadvantages. So I actually think there's a bunch of people, and I've interviewed a couple, where the coming into the office is so difficult for them that it can either put them off a job or it can make it very difficult for them. So being able to work some of the time, or maybe most of the time at home, and only coming in occasionally, would clearly give them an opportunity to contribute in a way that they would otherwise would find really difficult. Having said that, and Charlie just described her situation with the interview. It's more difficult to communicate like this, and I've seen plenty of examples of other people that I'm coaching and mentoring, not necessarily people that are neurodivergent, but just youngsters that are looking for support during the lockdown. And if you're new in a role or new in a career or anything like that, actually not having that ability to just listen to what's going on around you in the office, pick up the cues, and really have a sense of what's going on is difficult for anyone. But if you've got particular challenges around how you communicate and how you understand the world, that makes it more difficult. So I think for some it's helpful, for others it could be a disadvantage, and I suppose like the rest of us, it's a balance.
Again, slightly skewed on the FS side, financial services side, Ian. But Hammond Mystery just wondered if you'd had any experiences of local authorities taking up the neurodivergent process to recruitment.
I don't have a lot of experience of that. I did do a talk at the start of the year, which was for one of the CIPD regions, and there was a lot of HR people present, including some people from local authorities and boroughs, and they were clearly thinking about it and recognizing that it's a subject that they wanted to do more about, but I didn't have a chance to find out exactly what they'd done.
Rob Davis asks, do you have any specific thoughts on attracting and encouraging neurodivergent talent before they enter the workplace, i.e. in schools and universities? Maybe that's happening now, I don't know. Good question, Rob.
It is a good question, and it is interesting. People are starting to do that. And a bit like we've had, over the last 10, 20 years, programs where, certainly I worked in a lot of engineering companies like Skanska and Network Rail, and we wanted more women in our business, and we went into schools and we were trying to educate to young girls to the advantages of doing STEM subjects before, their kind of lack of understanding chose them, and often their parents pushed them to go a certain route in their options, and it kind of precluded them from moving into certain careers. Well, I think, I know of a couple of organizations, particularly in the US, who are probably the most advanced in this, where they are now going into universities and giving talks and guidance and sort of explaining about the organization and perhaps talking about internships. And I think it will come a time when, we should be doing that in schools as well, so that people can A, feel good about themselves, but B, also start to think about how do I really maximize the talents I've got. I have actually interviewed a couple of autistic people who had been put off from applying for certain jobs because their parents had said, you won't fit in there. And actually it was the employer that had actually worked really hard to say, yes, you will. We really welcome you. Please come and join us. Wow.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, there's unconscious bias on both sides sometimes. Tonya comes up with a very interesting question and view. In her words, this community has been largely ignored by the D&I movement, and therefore it's really remarkably important that we listen to people like yourself who really understand this topic. But there are many areas of diversity to consider. Tonya would be interested to hear from you, Ian, whether this puts an even greater spotlight on the inclusion side of D&I and how we could effectively develop a more effective inclusion culture strategy.
Yeah.
And then following on from that, the diversity piece.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I absolutely agree. And actually, one of the articles that I referenced there at the end, and you'll be able to click onto afterwards if you're interested, is an article I wrote where I said, I actually think that we've got it the wrong way around. We shouldn't be talking about D and I. We should be talking about I and D. For me, inclusion is much more important than D, because as I said right at the start, if you bring people who are different into the organization, then just sit them in the corner and don't listen to them, well, what's the point? It's the inclusion bit. It's making them feel welcome and making them doing what you need to do to get them to be able to feel comfortable and bring that difference. That's why they're brilliant for you. And just on the range of kind of things that are going on in the diversity world, you're right. It makes it more challenging, and certainly that is difficult. And I know from running a HR department, you often have both limited budget, but often also limited bandwidth that the organization can cope with to listen to different subjects. So you have to choose your moment as a HR person as to when it's right to capitalize on something and promote something. One organization I've just recently come across, which is very much financial services industry orientated, is called the Diversity Project. and they work across financial services. They have ambassadors and representatives from lots of FS businesses, and they have a group that's focusing on each aspect of D&I, or I&D as we should now call it. And there's a neurodiversity section within that, which I've now joined. And if you're in FS and are interested, then that's another source of information and thoughts.
Yeah, and that comes back to another point from Kim, actually, where how many employees, how many employers are actually hiring neurodivergent people as a case of corporate social responsibility, rather than, and she's using your own words, Ian, that they're dancing like there is no tomorrow.
Yeah, I think there might be a danger that some people do that. Interestingly, the organisations I've researched have all been quite passionate that that's not why they've done it, and actually they would feel uncomfortable if that was what has driven them. They want people to know, both the people themselves and the business, that they're actually business benefits. These are talented individuals we're bringing into the business. This isn't a charity operation. This is something for the benefit of all. Some organisations might see it different, and it might be a way to get started, but the ones I've interviewed were certainly very strong on that.
Yeah, you may have started a new movement, Ian, because I think a lot of people talk about culture, diversity and inclusion, and from what you're talking about, it should be inclusion creates diversity, which will change culture.
Exactly. Yep.
Look, there's so many things being flicked on the chat room, Ian. I've got to be honest, I've learned so much today, but I'm just conscious of the time, and I do thank you for yours, but I'm going to pass over to Christina now for closing comments, if I may.
Thank you, Paul. We hope you have all found the session informative and interesting. Hanover will email you a feedback survey, so we'll be so grateful for your comments and a follow-up discussion. And I know Ian would be fascinated to hear from those of you that decide to take some action today by getting your firm to move neurodiversity up the corporate ladder. So as it's a National Inclusion Week, Hanover is sharing best practices on how businesses can improve inclusion in the workplace that can be found across our social media platforms. But for now, I just want to say a big thank you to Ian, a big thank you for everyone for your time, and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.